Ladies and gentlemen,
Good evening.
Are you ready?
Okay, here we go.
You're listening to the Deal Room Podcast. Join us as we bring you the inside scoop on business sales and acquisitions. Get across trends in the area and hear the industry's best recount their real-life tips, traps, and experiences. Now, here's your host, Joanna Oakey.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here and welcome back to the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Now, today we have on the show Larry Green from Xclusive Business Sales to talk all about the sale and acquisitions of medical practices and why it's about more than just the numbers. In this episode, we talk about a number of different examples of the types of medical practices that Larry has recently organised to be sold. In particular, we look at the case study of a small medical clinic, a mid-sized practice, and a large general practice. And we look at the difference in the sale price that was achieved in each of these different businesses and why the sale price was different based on more than just the revenue of the practices. And we also dig into ultimately what the value is in a medical practice and how it is for sellers to maximise that value and for buyers to ensure that that value is transferable to them as they take over the new business. So that's it. Buckle in. Here we go with Larry Green and looking at medical practices and why it's more than just the numbers. Larry, hello. Welcome onto the Deal Room Podcast.
Welcome to you. Nice to have you on.
It's great to have you on, Larry. And I know you're still, as we're recording this, Melbourne is still in stage 4 lockdown. So you're putting on a brave face, notwithstanding the crazy.
It's Groundhog Day.
Yeah. I bet it is. I bet it is. All right. So today we're talking about this topic of medical practices and that being more than just about the numbers, which is, I think, a great way of setting out some of the, perhaps the synopsis of where we're getting to today. But maybe before we kick it off, Larry, can you give us a really quick background of who you are and why you're talking about medical practices?
Okay. Well, I've been a business broker for probably 18 or 19 years now. And I've been sort of focusing on the medical space for the last 6 or 7 years, partly because I found it a very interesting area to get into. My background is in the health sciences. I'm actually a biochemist by training, and I spent 15 years in the pharmaceutical industry. So I have a sort of
interesting
an empathy with the profession, and I have friends and acquaintances who are in either pharmacy or medical and things like that. So I found it challenging and ultimately rewarding as well. Our company, I'm the medical and health sales specialist in Victoria, but I also assist my colleagues in other states. I've just been helping out with somebody in South Australia who's doing a valuation on a dental practice. I can provide support for those people as well. So I do valuations on practices. I do valuations on related businesses like physiotherapy practices and chiropractic.
Great. Okay. And can I ask, it's interesting as you're talking, I am just reflecting and thinking, oh, that's interesting. I wonder, why was it that you became a business broker? This might be a little bit off topic, but I'm okay. Often quite interested in the story behind that.
Yeah, I was working with a colleague of mine when we taught at RMIT University, and we went out and did small medium enterprise consulting, and we were working with accountants and helping them develop their businesses, but in return we would get clients of theirs to work on to improve their businesses. And over a period of time, we were starting to get don't help them fix the place, they want to sell it. Yeah, we can sell it and do that sort of stuff. And that's how it changed. And we were looking at helping people buy businesses as well. And we did a little bit of work on that, but it was mainly that changeover from they really just want to get out of this business and can you help them do that? And we started the process before we were probably aware of our legal requirements, but we managed to get over that fairly quickly. I'm now.
I read the lines.
I've held a license, as you probably know, we're under the Estate Agents Act here in Victoria, and I've had an agent's rep, and now I've had a full license for about 10 years or so. So that's how we work, and that's how.
That's interesting. And what do you like most about business broking? I'm sorry, I'm taking us off topic here, but we'll come back. This is my last off-topic question.
Well, look, it's as I mentioned the word challenging before. I think it is challenging. Sometimes I was talking to somebody just recently. It would be lovely to work in an area where you made something. And here's a widget, and you sell it, and you get customers and that sort of stuff. I've always been in sales. In one form or the other. And even in pharmaceuticals, you never sold anything to the person you were talking to. It was really just getting them to think about using the product and challenging that way. So that's part of why I found it interesting that you're selling in different ways. You're selling yourself to somebody to get the business, to get the listing, and then you're selling the business to a marketplace. And then you're selling back to your client, the vendor, the offers that come in, and that's really it's wearing different hats at different times. It's not a straightforward selling. I think that's a challenging thing for me as well, and it's very flexible. You can do different things in different ways.
It is interesting because a lot of what you're talking about there I resonate with because, from a legal perspective, I love this industry because it lets you deal with lots of different people, but everyone is almost always aligned for the same objective, just to get these deals across the line, right? But it's just fabulous sometimes seeing people come in and have the opportunity to acquire a business and breathe this new fresh life into it. And, it can be a very rewarding area. But anyway, that's probably enough of the background. I just always like to understand a bit. And so we're talking about medical practices here. What do you think the differences between the sale of medical practices and other types of general businesses? Are there things that you think make this a bit of a specialist? Well, I think it is a specialist area, but what are your thoughts about that and why?
Yeah, I mean, medical practices are businesses. That's the first thing I think you have to appreciate. Second thing is that, yes, there are some unique aspects of these businesses that need to be taken into consideration. You're dealing with highly trained professionals, medical practitioners with varying understanding of business, and some of them are very smart and able to appreciate the business.
But often time poor, aren't they? That's one of the things that I notice, in this industry.
Yeah, their prime concern is their patients, as it should be, and so they don't have as much time to focus on how to run a business or to maximise profits and things like that. In fact, I've just signed up to attend an online forum over the weekend on scaling up businesses and medical practices in particular in this case. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that there are overlays, as you have in other businesses, but I think this is more pronounced, of government intervention that actually can control how much money people earn through the Medicare rebate, and it's been frozen for a long time. So there's those issues. I think there's technology taking a bigger place in how practices run, both from just purely practice software through to integrating software and making things easier. Practitioners can subscribe to things like HotDoc and Health Engine that can generate appointments for them. Telehealth is changing, the way people approach medicine as well. So there's a lot of things that you need to take into consideration.
And I guess, one of the things that strikes me about the medical, dental, health services type industries is also there can be quite a different approach to how they staff, the approach of staffing, rather than just, many businesses are more the traditional employment relationship. So they have employees. Obviously, in this industry, there's lots of different approaches to that. So I guess that's another factor that...
doctors can be employed in inverted commas, either as subcontractors, working on a percentage of the income that they generate. For new practices and for particularly doctors coming into a practice, sometimes they can be on an hourly rate for a period until their earnings sort of balance out that percentage basis. You've got people like allied health can work within a practice, physios, dietitians, podiatrists, whatever it might be. And they can either rent a room from that doctor, or they can act as subcontractors as well, which is, whatever they earn, the doctor gets a percentage of that and they get the other percentage. So there are differences. There's usually nurse practitioners that work within the practice, and they can be full-time, part-time, and have different roles. And then administrative staff, there's usually most of the time there's a practice manager. Not necessarily the wife of the owner of the doctor's, thing, but can be a professional practice manager. And then there's a whole range of administrative staff, receptionists, and people like that. And a lot of people within those practices don't work full time, so you've got to manage the flow of staff coming in and out.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So I think that makes the industry quite different. And the reason I'm talking about this is because I think it's important for people to understand selling a medical practice isn't necessarily just a standard thing, in just like selling any other businesses. There are nuances in the industries. So okay, all right. And before we get stuck into talking about some case studies, let's just quickly talk about buyer profile. So what is the most likely, what are the different buyer profiles? Who are buyers of medical practices? And around about where is that sitting in, broken down into, rough percentages at the moment?
I don't know that I can be accurate in percentages, but we'll work our way through this and probably come as we do this. So there are a lot of overseas trained doctors who are now calling Australia home, who've gone through the process of having their qualifications recognised by the federal government and now have gone through being only allowed to work in country areas, regional areas. So they end up being what we call vocationally registered, which means that they can work anywhere. They become fellows of the College of General Practitioners, and they're now looking to buy practices because they've, if you like, done their apprenticeship in Australia. They've often wanted to come back and live in the major cities for family reasons, kids going to school, university, and joining back into communities. Some have made very successful lives in those regional areas. So that's one group. The second is people who already own a practice, or two or three or whatever it might be, who are looking to expand their business, size. And so they're probably very well experienced in what it takes to run a practice and probably understand the buying process as well. And then you've got the big corporates and medium corporates, who might have up to 30 or 40 practices. IPN, what was Primary, now Helios, which has now been sold, but they've got, 50, maybe 100 odd practices, whatever it is, across Australia. So there's some very large ones. Then you've got, so there can be doctors or non-doctors. So you could have non-doctor investors who are, and I've got some of those, who buy practices from me, who see medicine as both a profitable but also a worthwhile business to be involved with. I have to sometimes tell them that, that buying a small practice is not going to be to their betterment, but to buy a much larger practice helps them because they're not generating their own income, only generating money through what that comes into the practice from that percentage that goes to the practice that doesn't go to the doctors. So there is a range. Now, it's been said for a number of years that Australian graduates are not buying practices, and that's probably still true. and we don't know whether it's a generational thing or, the Gen X, Gen Y type of situation, or it's more cultural that they prefer to work for a few years in a practice, build up a bit of, experience and maybe buy into that practice or leave and buy their own practice, start their own practice, whatever it might be. The other thing is that there's also 60 to 70% of all graduates through the medical schools in Australia are female. So they're not going to buy practices to the same extent as males. And there's probably another major reason why Australian graduates aren't buying.
That's an interesting point. What makes you say that?
It can't be categorical, and I noticed this from my working in pharmacy as well, that a lot of women see some of these professions as being very flexible in terms of hours. So if you want to have a family, then you can have time to and work in the hours when your kids are at school, and you can work those hours. You don't have to do weekend work. You don't have to do evening work. So you can make it, suit you. And therefore, it's less likely that you want to buy a practice. Now, as I say, I can probably point you, and one of my examples today was a female doctor owner. So it does happen. But I think in terms of proportion, there are more male owners than female owners.
So, and you think that comes from the fact that through ownership comes, essentially less flexibility.
Absolutely. More responsibility, less flexibility.
Creates difficulty, from a family perspective. Okay, all right. Well, that's an interesting one. I hadn't thought about that. So let's look here then at some examples between the difference between selling a small medical clinic and a large medical clinic and, maybe one in the middle.
Okay, well, let's start with the smaller one. And the one I've chosen is one that's fairly fresh. It's about 12 months ago now, I think we sold this one. This was located at a small shopping centre in Melbourne southeast, not that far from Port Phillip Bay. It was a relatively small physically. It had 2 consulting rooms plus a pathology room plus a treatment room, procedure room. And it was owned by a female doctor of Indian background, and she had one female part-time doctor who supported her, plus a part-time nurse. So it's not a particularly big practice. We sold it for $100,000 plus some small amount of stock, which is consumable items, medicines, just general consumable items. And then the owners put in a retention clause into this, that they would pay another $26,000 after 12 months if the doctor continued to work in the practice at agreed hours. So this is something I wanted to highlight, because this will happen in all of the practices except maybe 1 or 2, where the owners are required to stay with the practice. And the main reason is that we want to try and protect the goodwill. If the practice owner leaves a practice in a short period of time, then you're probably going to see quite a drift away, leaking out, whatever term you want to use, of patients. And when somebody buys a practice, what they're buying is they're buying the doctor, but they're really buying the patient. So if you don't have that continuity, then you don't get your value. Now, we originally priced this considerably higher, at over $300,000, which in some respects the figures could cope with that, if you like. But really what happens is that people say, we can't scale this practice up to any great extent. We physically don't have the space, and we possibly could increase the hours and have slightly more doctors coming through the practice, but we can only ever have 2 or 3 doctors there at any one time. And that's the problem with some of these smaller practices. And it has to go to a doctor who can work in the practice. Just this issue of if I'm not working, I'm not generating my own income, I'm never going to make enough money just as an investor. So that's the small one. A very attractive little practice, not to say it wasn't. And it had a very feminine feel about it because the female doctors were working there, which was not in any way a criticism, but it had a very gentle family feeling about it. But it was small. The mid-sized practice is one that I've settled literally at the end of the financial year just passed. So we've gone now from barely 1.5 full-time equivalent doctors to now about 4 to 5 doctors in this practice. I think it was probably call it 4. It's in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, northeast suburbs. The owner was over 80, of Chinese, Singaporean background. His wife had joined the practice as the practice manager, also of a similar age. It was a building that they owned, and they'd combined, in fact, 2 buildings to make a much bigger practice quite a few years ago. And they're turning, obviously now turning over a lot more money because there's more doctors. And this comes to how they report income, because they can report what we would call absolute gross income, or the income that you've got that comes into the business after the doctors get their share of this. So that's another thing to look out for. Profit was quite reasonable, but it was really the owner's profit. So it was what we would call a PBITA rather than an EBITDA figure here. And in fact, we had 2 offers on this, and we accepted the first one, and they started their due diligence, and they were people I knew who were not practicing medical people, but they were investors. But the numbers just didn't work. When you looked at that, they've got to keep paying the other doctors, and there's no money being generated by them.
Yeah.
So we found a second doctor who was an owner-operator, and he worked in the practice for a short while before settlement, and I met him after he moved in, and thrilled to bits. The old owners said that they've never seen the practice so busy because he brought new patients in, and he said to me it's the best decision he's ever made. Now, that practice, we actually virtually got our asking price, because the benefit to that purchaser was very high. There's a great number of things that worked for him. It was close to home, relatively. It was only 10-minute drive from home. He knew the area. His wife was also a doctor, but worked at the Epping Northern Hospital, which is only a short distance away. Everything came together. So he was happy to pay, I think we got about $550, and we didn't value it for much less than that. We put it on the market for a little bit more, but we valued it at around about $530, something like that.
So it's an interesting sort of business, isn't it? So so we said we've got revenue of around about $1 million, profit including the owner's wages of about $290. But if we took out what would be the owner's wage, expectation in this type of business, probably around the 200.
Could be a little bit more, because it depends on the practitioner and how many hours they're working. But if an owner is working what I would call your 38-hour, 40-hour week, an owner of a practice can generate, and I've seen it, I've got one now at the moment, where they can generate $600,000 or $700,000 worth of fees. So if you looked at, say, let's call it 650, and you multiply that by 0.7, 70%, so their wage could be $455,000.
But I guess I'm going off if we've got $1 million revenue and 290 in profit that includes the owner's wage, but say we take 200 out of it, like we're just sitting, if you're looking at an investor, you're saying, well, here's a business that's making 90K profit. So a sale price of 550K is
doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Consider pretty good, right? So It's interesting. So that's why, I guess it's an example of, if you're using figures like that, why this is more attractive to to people who are in the profession rather than pure investors.
Now, in this case, the owner, as I said, during COVID, due to his age, wasn't really working in the practice much at all.
Right.
Mainly telehealth. So the arrangement post-settlement is that he will probably continue to do that rather than come and sit in the practice for any great length of time.
Interesting.
And it's interesting because when I think about this is a larger practice, but we actually sold it for less, and I'll explain why. Now, this had 6 or 7 doctors in it, maybe up to 8 at certain times, but the owner was not present. The owner was actually living in the UK. She lived in the area for some time, moved the practice from one, this is a regional practice. When I say regional, the outer fringe of Melbourne, in the Yarra Valley. And so she moved the practice from Healesville to Yarra Glen, and she had to go back to the UK for family reasons and didn't return. And so this was, run by a practice manager who was terrific, and the doctors enjoyed working there. And it was a very large building, an ex-childcare centre, I think, and so it had been built, modified accordingly, and had 9 consulting rooms, treatment rooms, pathology. They had heaps of visiting allied health practitioners. Didn't generate as much income as you thought. It was probably around about 750,000, and the profit was about 100,000, and that didn't include the owner's wage in this case, because she just wasn't there.
Right.
Whatever she just took drawings out of the business. We sold it for 320,000 plus stock, but we'd only valued it at 258. So why did we get another $60,000? Well, we got that because the buyers were very keen to buy a regional practice. That was their focus. They now own 6 practices, I think. All of them are in very similar areas. They're not in the middle of cities. They're in sort of outer suburban-ish areas, regional, and it suited them. And they saw from the capacity that they had, they could put more doctors in there and make it work. And of course, because they're investors, they needed to have a full complement of doctors working there. But their model was such that they'd already had the economies of scale in administration and all that sort of stuff, so they could actually probably turn a better profit over time than a single practice would have. And they didn't have to worry about the doctor staying on because she wasn't there. And that's a pretty good example. I have one the largest practice I've ever sold was 8 doctors in the southeast suburbs or eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and we got nearly 850,000 for that practice. But the new owners one was a doctor, and his wife had been the practice manager. The 2 principal doctors were going to stay on for 3 years because they were not that old. They were in their early 60s, late 50s. That suited them to do that, and the numbers made a hell of a lot of sense on that one. In fact, very profitable, very stable practice.
I'm fascinated. By this difference in the sale price between the mid-sized practice and the large general practice. From a general, sale of business perspective, we say that businesses that are able to run on without the prior owners, without much of a handover, generally have a higher value than businesses where the prior owners are more integrated into the business. And certainly in a business like medical practice, where you've got this client relationship that is at risk, whenever we've got a transition and need to add more doctors in. And so I find it very interesting then, on the basis of that the larger practice that ticked that box more than the smaller, the medium-sized practice, ended up with a far lower sale price. So it had higher income, probably ultimately a similar amount of profit at the end of the day once you sort of factor in owner's wage for the amount of work that was being done. The larger practice seemed more set up for a better transition. So tell us, what was the secret? And maybe is there something in this that vendors might think about as they prepare for sale that was the magic secret between the difference, the reason why the mid-sized practice outperformed the larger practice in this instance at sale?
I sort of indicated earlier that it really is what the purchaser wants.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the first thing. So as we know, value is in the eye of the beholder. Yes, we can show numbers, but those numbers have to make sense to that particular person based on, and that mid-sized practice, it was location, size, and the doctors who were already there, and just it fitted that person's lifestyle as much as anything else. Okay, so you're willing to pay a little bit more. Now, he obviously had somebody do the due diligence on the figures, and the accountant said to me, "Look, if without the owner's wage, this breaks even." And I said, "Yep, we're selling it on that basis, but with the owner working in that practice, it's very attractive financially, very attractive financially." And the owners of that practice over the years, and they obviously had it for a long time, but showing their age in the 80s, that they were able to live a fantastic lifestyle, you know, and invest heavily and that sort of stuff. So that's the first thing. The smaller practices tend to be, you have to work harder to keep the money going. That's the other thing. There are ways to use the system, which is Medicare in this case. And if you're willing to do that, then you can generate money. But you've got to, you know, is bulk billing, a bulk billing practice as good as a privately billing practice? There can be ways that it does make sense. Other times, you know, you've got to see 6 patients an hour rather than 4.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So let's see if we can bring this down then to some action tips, Larry. What is it that you suggest for vendors who are planning ahead for sale?
First thing, and you mentioned the word already, is plan.
Yeah.
Don't leave this to the last minute. Think as long ahead as you can, maybe 5 years, to make sure you get everything ready. Your mindset as much as anything else. Secondly,
agree.
Understand that you will have to do something post-sale. You'll have to stay with the practice. 1, 2, 3 years, whatever it is, up to you and your purchaser, you'll have to do that. Get your financials in order, okay? Make sure that they are complete, accurate, timely, all that sort of stuff. Make sure that the physical presence is standard. You know, it's clean, it's tidy, it's modern. People are welcomed. It feels comfortable. That
Looks
sort of
good.
stuff.
Yeah.
Make sure that any agreements you have with anybody in your employee or subcontractor, that those are up to date and are complete as well.
And compliant.
Absolutely, from a legal point of view. Understand what could happen in terms of staff entitlements. Annual leave, long service leave, that sort of stuff. I had one practice, which I'm still discussing with them, COVID's slowed everything down, that had something like $200,000 worth of entitlements that had to be paid out. You know, just ridiculous.
Just because they hadn't managed that over time, you know, and entitlements need to be managed. Yeah.
The accountant is in that case, to me, is negligent in that. Accreditation, make sure your accreditation is up to date. And you're working towards the next accreditation. Accreditation is a 3-year period, so you work towards getting it, and then you've got 3 years, and then at the end of the second year, you're already starting to think of that reaccreditation. Make sure that's done. If the building is owned by the owners of the practice, but in a different entity, just make sure that there is a lease. Is the rent commercial?
Oh, such a good point.
All that sort of stuff. Just to make sure that you understand what it's going. Are you going to sell the building or not sell the building?
Yeah, okay. And when is the right time to sell the building? Because, you know, often a sale in this sort of industry is for people who are headed into retirement, and there can be all sorts of timings for when the sale of not just the business, but the premises themselves can be more advantageous and less advantageous from a tax perspective. So, you know, there's sorts of things to understand for the future, because there are ways that we can get around this to still allow, you know, leasing for a period of time and then, you know, an option to sell or those sorts of things. But, you know, if you're not thinking about that until you've already signed the deal, you may not realise the tax liability that you're incurring.
If we forget tax for the moment, the other thing is that a lot of buyers are looking for investments as well.
Yeah.
So I've had practices which I haven't been able to sell as quickly as I thought because there was no property to sell.
Isn't that fascinating?
It is. And yet you'll get other ones, people say, no, I don't want to buy. The corporates don't buy property. Doesn't make sense to them. And the final thing that I put down here is that if you want to start thinking about selling, then have your practice valued. Find out why we come up with a figure that we do.
And what you can do to move the dial.
Exactly right. And so you can think about what can I do, and usually somebody like myself can guide them a little bit, but there are professionals also who look at managing practices and helping people do that. But it's really, if the practice has little value, it's because of some of the things we've discussed. It's too small. There's no scaling up. And that's the problem. So that's never going to change. But if you have a practice where it's in that grey area that it could be scaled up and we could put more doctors and we could have another couple of rooms or whatever it might be, or might have to move to a new location, then having that value and knowing what that value really means could be priceless really for the vendors, because they can start thinking, well, I'm going to get this much out of it, that I can start planning my future out of that as well. So that's the most important for me, is really don't go into this thinking that the practice is worth $1 million and it's never going to be worth a quarter of that. You know?
Yeah.
And you would know that there are unreasonable vendors, and medical practitioners are no different.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, it's this age-old issue of disappointment leading into sale because of lack of education along the way, and thinking that income equals value at sale as well, is another trap. So, which you've, so expertly demonstrated with some of your different case studies here.
For most practitioners, operators, this is still that classic buying a job.
Yeah.
But it's got to be that at the end of the day that there is sufficient money, that is what we would call the profit, to make this an attractive business. And that's the most important thing.
Brilliant. Well, look, Larry, I just want to say a massive thank you for coming on the Deal Room podcast today. If our listeners have a medical practice and they would like a bit of assistance with it, either in terms of understanding the value in advance so they can do some of this turning the dial, or because they're almost ready to hit the market, how do they contact you?
Well, they can contact me through the Xcllusive website, xclusive.com.au. I can certainly make my personal phone number available to them. My email address is larry@Xcllusive, and of course Xcllusive is spelled xcllusive.com.au. I'm more than happy to chat. There's no obligation, and I'm more than happy to help.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Larry. And look, as always, if you are running along the beach or on your commute to, well, where the hell would you be commuting to? You might be commuting to someone, I guess, if you're in New South Wales. Maybe not if you're with Larry.
I've got 5 kilometres to run in.
Oh dear. Well, we'll put those links in the show notes anyway, just in case we're out of lockdown by the time you're listening to this and you're actually doing something away from a notepad. Wonderful. Okay, Larry, thank you so much. We've loved having you on the show.
Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate it. Enjoyed it immensely.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Deal Room podcast. If you'd like more information about this topic, head over to our website at www.thedealroompodcast.com, where you'll be able to download a transcript of this podcast episode if you'd like to read it in more detail. There, you'll also be able to find details of how to contact Larry Green at Xclusive Business Sales. And there you'll also find details of how to contact our lawyers at Aspect Legal if you or your clients would like to discuss any legal aspects of sales or acquisitions. We've got a number of great services that assist businesses both on the buy side and the sell side. So don't hesitate to book an appointment if you'd like to find out how we might be able to assist. Well, that's it. Once again, thank you so much for listening in. You've been listening to Joanna Oakey and the Deal Room podcast. See you next time. Aspect Legal has a number of great services that help businesses prepare for a sale or acquisition. To help them prepare in advance and to get transaction ready. We've also got a range of services to help guide businesses through the sale and acquisitions process. We work with clients both big and small and have different types of services depending on size and complexity. We provide a free consultation to discuss your proposed sale or acquisition. So see our show notes on how to book a time to speak with us, or head over to our website at aspectlegal.com.au.
Ladies and gentlemen.
That will conclude this evening's entertainment.
Thanks for listening to the Deal Room Podcast. To find out more about this episode and other episodes in the series, check out the show notes or head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com.au.